Anybody sees the chat later? Okay, I'm very excited to start the Biomechanics in Everyday Life course. Okay, so I know many of you were excited about it. The big part of this course is going to be sorry, before I get started, if you would like to turn on your video, I would love to see your face. If not, that is totally fine. I understand. Okay, having gotten that out of the way. So biomechanics and cardio exercise. So let's review the session description and talk about what I actually mean by that. So here's what I posted in the session description. Biological movement is incredibly efficient. Efficient storage and retrieval of elastic energy by elastic tissues in the body is a key reason for efficient movement. And in this part of the class, we are going to understand exactly how this works. Okay, I hope you can still see me. Give me a thumbs up if you can. Excellent. Thank you. So there are a lot of words here, I think, which are worth defining and going through. So I've highlighted them here. What makes movement efficient? What is elastic energy? What are elastic tissues? And how can we use motion capture to study them? So that will be the main theme for this section. And this video will also be available to you after the class. So biomechanics is the science of movement of a living body, including how muscles, bones, tendons, and ligaments work together to produce movement. The key word for this course is going to be together. We are going to explore principles of how things work together to produce movement. And I know a large part of biomechanics is a reductionist approach where you see the action of, I don't know, your bicep on your forearm. Not to say that it's not useful, a lot has been deduced from that, but if we are to apply it, we need to take a look at how we move as a whole. And we're going to explore some ideas, and I'll show you some of my own work in the process. Please feel free to post your questions as you see them. Okay, excellent. So first, I'm going to start. I think I need to reshare my screen to enable sound. Okay, so I'm going to show you a video of somebody jumping rope. You might, many people might recognize this person. Okay, excellent. So are you, I can't see you, so I don't have any feedback. Could you raise your thumbs up if you could hear the sound? Excellent, okay. Okay, thank you. Now, this if you don't know who that was Floyd Mayweather. He is a very famous boxer, and some words you can use to describe his move. He's very quick, and he has this uncanny efficiency in terms of getting punches through, right? So let's try to understand some processes that might be helpful in creating quick, efficient, and how to construct such types of movements. So the inspiration we draw from are artists and people who study refined movement throughout their lives, right? So they produce elegant and efficient movements. So appreciating elegance generalizes across movement disciplines. It's not just one. And somehow, even if you're not trained in a specific discipline, if we watch somebody who is really, really good, say we're watching Olympics, we sort of know, okay, so this person is good. How can we tell that? That's also an interesting question. So at any point, refer to the left part of your screen. So there are 5 main themes I'm dealing with at this moment, and I'm highlighting the one I'm dealing with at the current moment. Okay, so this is an example. So I don't know if you can tell, but hopefully you can tell the difference in how good or how trained somebody is, or rather, who would you rather not fight? Put it that way. So now, how would you describe movement that you appreciate? Think of a few words that you might use to describe movement. So I'm going to show you this video clip one more time. So in your own words, what would you use to describe these movements? Feel free to type a word or a phrase. You can submit more than one. Now I'm biasing you. These are all excellent answers. I'm going to wait just a couple more seconds to see if there's any more. Okay, so fluid, graceful, effortless, minimal, smooth, elegant, efficient. Somehow all of these seem to go together. That's the point I want you to appreciate from this word cloud that we collected from everyone. I know I sort of biased you towards elegant by using those words, but let's try to see if somehow efficiency and elegance are connected, and if so, what principles can we use to understand that sort of connection. This will be more and more clear throughout the course. Okay, so now we talked about biomechanics, we talked about efficient movement, and to understand some things that go along with efficient movements, I agree with all the things you said, flowing, elegant. And now we're going to talk about the parts of the body that are responsible for this. An important part are elastic tissues in the body. So muscles, tendons, ligaments, and connective tissue are the elastic tissues that are responsible for creating gooey, smooth, elegant movement. Right? So these elements have elastic properties like springs. Unlike springs, they don't push out when they're compressed. But like springs, they can exert a pull force when they're stretched. If you work with the resistance band, so you know that if I shorten it, it's just going to go slack and nothing's going to happen. But if I hold it, now there is some capacity for this band to do some work, right? So I can use it by just either letting go, or I can just retrieve it by using less force to move my arms back, right? So it's a way of storing energy. Right? So these tissues, which are throughout our body, offer a way of storing and retrieving energy. And how we play our cards and how precisely can we store and retrieve energy is one of the most important mechanisms to create good and efficient movement. So muscles are special in the sense that they exert pull forces in response to input from the brain. And muscles can exert passive forces when stretched, meaning if a muscle length increases, say I stretched out my arm, right? So if my muscle length increased somewhere here, then they can exert a force across the joint without having to continuously receive information from the brain or input from the brain. So in that sense, you're saving energy. Of course, you can't turn off everything simultaneously. That doesn't work. So often it is more useful to think about elastic tissues as rubber bands as opposed to springs, right? So I think this is an important point, and it shapes how we actually think about movement as a whole. So what is elastic energy? So we looked at biomechanics, efficient movement, and elastic tissue. Now, what is elastic energy? So when I stretch the resistance band, then it has more energy to do, capacity to do more work. So there are two factors here, right? So here, hopefully, you can see a skinny elastic resistance band and a thick one, right? So we use these. We could use this for different exercises, whatever it is. So for the same amount of stretch, the thicker one can store more energy, and the thinner one will store less energy. So this will become important in a little bit, but it is one of the factors that determines how much length is an important factor, which we'll see a lot of, right? And the tone, which is also an important factor. So now let's talk about motion capture, right? So we use motion capture because I said length is an important factor. We can use motion capture to track the lengths of muscles at high speeds. Here is an example of what you'll see. As you'll see later, it is not obvious where and how much energy is stored and retrieved from. What I want you to think about at this moment is elastic energy is not the only type of energy, and there is also kinetic energy, right? So the faster we move, the more kinetic energy we have. So in the context of this video, I'm up above in the air here. So pay attention to the green line and the white bar across the green line. Hopefully you can see the resolution is good enough that you can see. Please give me a thumbs up that you can see the graphs. Okay, excellent. Now I'm up in the air somewhere here, right? And I have, sorry, apologies. And I am there is a moment of pause, right? At that moment of pause, there is very little kinetic energy in my body. The kinetic energy, meaning just from me moving, is maximum just before I touch down. The moment I touch down, I slow down very quickly and my center comes to a stop, and then I take off again, right? So I'm repeating this bouncing motion over and over again. So let's think about where kinetic energy is most. It is at this time point, right before the touchdown. Kinetic energy is least both right before takeoff and right at the top of the bounce, right? So those are two things to keep in mind. And as this is happening, muscles are changing length throughout, right? So there is some notion of elastic energy relating to muscle length, right? So it doesn't correspond exactly one-to-one. It depends on the other properties of the tissue, but it's a good proxy. So I'm going to show you elastic and different amounts of elastic energy stored in this one muscle. It's called the latissimus dorsi. I'm going to show you a video where I'm going to turn. Right. So at this point there is less elastic energy in my lat compared to this point, right? So I still haven't turned yet. So what I'm doing is I'm storing energy in my lat and I'm using it to turn. Okay. So what is the role of elastic energy in efficient movement? Now, at this point, if you look at the left of your screen, I'm trying to relate the different concepts that I just introduced, right? So now, how does elastic energy relate to efficient movement? If you're able to store more elastic energy in tissues and retrieve a greater fraction of the stored energy, we can create more efficient movement. Elastic energy retrieval depends on the timing and precision of muscle activities which move elastic energy between different muscle systems in the body. Typically, when we think about muscles being active, we think about them as levers that exert forces on bones to create movement. This is correct, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But it also doesn't explain a lot of the passive activity that goes on in the body. So let's look at this jump thing again in the context of energy cycle. So in the context of elastic energy is the length of my muscle, right? Kinetic energy is how fast I'm going. So what I'm suggesting here is that when I'm going slow, I have a lot of elastic energy, and when I'm going fast, I have the less elastic energy. Presumably, maybe, I don't know. So there is a continuous conversion between these two types of energy, and these are not the only two available, right? One important thing I have left out is muscular effort, which we deal with a lot in biomechanics, right? So how does that fit in? Think of it as just another part of a third entry, if you will, and then energy conversions happen across all three. But the nice thing about muscular effort, which is changing of chemical energy into, you change that into forces and do work, right? So perhaps, let's place the energy cycle now, the idea of energy cycle. At this point, I have a lot of kinetic energy, and then I'm going to go, and then I'm going to go down. And at the point of touchdown, I start receiving energy. I start storing up the energy from the impact in my body. And then I somehow do a bunch of things happen, and then I use it, including muscular effort, but a large part of it is this. So it's the feeling when you get that flow in running, or when you feel like suddenly you can jump like twice as much or 5 times as much within the gap of a day. Probably these ideas fit in together better in your body. So perhaps these are ideas, right? So world-class athletes and artists master the ability to convert between different forms of energy. And perhaps when we watch well-executed movements in this sense, somehow we are able to appreciate them. So this is simply an idea, right? So we're going to go a little more deep into it. So these elastic energy cycle happens anytime there is movement, right? Anytime you hit the floor, every step you take. So I'm going to monitor the length of the same muscle that I showed you, the lat, during walking. So below, the green trace shows the length of the lat. There's a clear rhythm to it, right? So it's a periodic function, walking, and then there is also a clear rhythm to how much the length of the latissimus dorsi corresponding to the phase of my gait cycle. So I'm going to play the same video in slow motion. See if you can identify the point at which it starts rising. Walking is a little bit more complicated than jumping, just because you have to pay attention to which foot is going down depending on which lat, because it's alternating, but it's still the same idea. So the idea here is that another concept is up to a certain length, when muscles are stretched, for the same amount of input from the brain, they can exert bigger forces, right? So the only way to exert more forces is not just getting more muscle, it's also becoming more efficient in this sense, playing with the lengths of muscles. Right? So let's use the energy cycle in the context of less common movement. So this is a hip turn. It looks something like this. Right? So I'm just trying to turn on one leg. So, and here I'm looking at the length of the lat as I turn. I don't think about the length of my lat every time I turn. Obviously, all of this happens unconsciously. But if I look at it and analyze it later, then I notice that I stretch first, and then I turn. Right. So if you happen to notice, the y-axis is a very different scale compared to walking. So here, there is a 10% change in the length of the lat when I'm walking, right? So and then there is like a 50% change when I try to do something more interesting from the perspective of art or whatever it is, right? Athletics or whatever it is. So the idea is, one interesting idea is perhaps we use the same mechanisms in the same sequencing that we use innately as we walk or breathe to create movements. We just modify them in very specific ways to create all of these different types of movements. So we thought about movement from the thinking about movement from the perspective of the whole, I said, is very important in terms of applying it, as opposed to thinking about it from the perspective of one muscle. So I'm going to try something because we started early. Let me see if this works. The concept that I want to, so first maybe I can switch to speaker view. Hopefully you can see me. So the idea that I want to illustrate is, I'm going to use this toy to illustrate this concept. Right, so I'll talk about this a little bit more, but the idea is it has rigid elements similar to bones, and it has elastic elements similar to muscles, but it doesn't have, it doesn't have a nervous system or an actual muscle, so there is only passive forces at play here. There are no active forces. So for example, I can morph it, right? So if I put force somewhere in one place, the whole thing changes, right? It's not just one thing that's changing. Now, let me see if I can give you a live demonstration of what this looks like in motion capture. Thumbs up if you can see the screen. Excellent. On the wrong camera. So this little toy has infrared reflective markers. I put it's basically paint and tape, right? So if I walk into it, right? So as I walk, I see it move. Right? So I can stay there, I can stretch it out, I can change shape, do whatever I want, and then the activity is going to get recorded. Right? So the positions of each of the vertices here is going to, I can monitor that at high speed. So thumbs up if you manage to see dots moving. Thank you. Okay, so let me share my own screen again. Okay, so like the toy that I just showed you, our body incorporates both rigid. How do they work together? Right? It looks like I ended up with some technical difficulties. If you can see me and hear me now, please give me a thumbs up. Thank you. Okay, so what I showed you, it's called a tensegrity structure, right? So it has decades of history of what it is, and there's many useful applications. One application, people use this to build a bridge in Australia. And another application, there are many of these sculptures where it looks like all of these rods just floating in the air, but they're incredibly powerful and resistant to external forces. Right? So they don't collapse very easily. So NASA uses this to build space exploration robots. I'm going to reshare my screen with audio so you can hear what this person is saying.
We are using tensegrity structures, which are these tensile networks that are very shock absorbent, compliant, and we're using those to build robots or planetary landers that can land on another planet, absorb that impact shock, and then that very same structure is your robot that enables mobility on the planetary surface.
Okay, thumbs up if you could see, if you could hear sound. Thank you. Okay, so from the perspective of the whole, he was using elastic energy to build these robots just to cushion the impact. But think about this: what if we were able to recycle that energy and use it however we want it? Right? So let's study the energy cycle of a tensegrity sphere. I'm going to show you what happens when I drop it on the ground. So what I'm measuring, so because I know where all the vertices are, I'm measuring all the positions of all the vertices. And I know which bands connect to which vertices, so I'm calculating the total length. So if you look at this, there's about 12 elastic bands of this size, so that all adds up to like 400 centimeters or so. The change is very small, but let's look at this in slow motion again. I'm going to show you one more time. So it's going to go to the ground, it's going to touch the floor, and then it's morphing into all of these different shapes. It's like 5 milliseconds, right? And at this point, it has done morphing and it starts reversing its morph. And at this point, it's still on the floor, and somewhere here, it takes off the floor, right? So there's this notion of elastic energy storage and elastic energy retrieval. Okay, so the energy storage starts at touchdown as soon as we hit the floor. In this case, energy retrieval finishes at liftoff when the sphere is about to leave the floor. And the whole thing lasted like, the whole video was 120 milliseconds. It takes 100 milliseconds for light to reach from your retina to go to the visual cortex. So it's very fast. That's probably why we can't actually appreciate it unless we take high-speed captures. So let's look at all the wiggling and jiggling of markers in the human body. Right. So a deeper analysis is required, but for now, just get an intuition. This is slow motion. There's lots of things moving around. You won't tell that there is so much movement if I play this at speed. So this is very slow. This is the same video that you saw before. But okay. So elastic energy, like the tensegrity system, once I get touchdown, it starts getting distributed across different muscle systems in the body. The muscles start lengthening, right? So now I'm highlighting. So don't pay attention to the specific name of the muscle system. We'll deal with it this next time. But I was monitoring multiple muscle systems simultaneously and examining the energy cycle in each muscle system. So this is in my back, right? So this is relative to touchdown. There might be a couple of frames of error in me detecting what the touchdown is because I did it visually. And this is the superficial front line, but the relative positions are good. There is a notion of increase in length and decrease in length. Even in my arms. So remember, maybe we can't observe this because there's a lot of movement going on, but the change is just 2%, but it's replicable. It's replicable to the point that you don't see the error bars. There are error bars on the graph. And this is my back functional line, and it also follows this cycle, right? So it's almost as if when I jump, elastic energy first started getting stored somewhere down, close to my legs, and the storage process started in my arm, went to the front, right? So the first one you see is my legs. The second one you see is the front. The third one you see is my arms, and the fourth one you see is my back. So it's like, so there's different elastic bands in the body, and each of them started picking up the signal that I touched down very quickly, right? So one after the other. So if you look at the X scale, the total time difference is like 100 milliseconds. To give you an intuition, the fastest I can jump is around 350 milliseconds per jump. And within just 100 milliseconds, all of these started storing elastic energy, and the storage time took different amounts of time to store this elastic energy in different muscle systems. So unlike tensegrity systems, where all the bands start expanding at the same time, muscles have viscoelastic properties. So the timing of elastic storage in each band is slightly different compared to a purely passive and system with no viscoelastic properties. So next, I would like to relate energy cycle to speed. So one thing we commonly do is we either walk, jog, run, or we jump slowly, we jump faster, we dance to slow music, we dance to fast music. So this is a very common thing that we change in everyday life. So, yes, fall time. What happens when we run faster? Please go to your Slido tab. I like this real-time update. Well, the bars are still changing, but it looks like the majority agrees that they work harder. Sure, they work harder. And then also a lot of people think they tone up more. And there seems to be sort of an even split in the idea that they increase in length or the idea that they decrease in length. So let's examine what happens, right? So we have our motion capture system. We can actually look at it. Okay, so there's a treadmill in the background. I don't know if you can see. I use that to run around and put markers on myself at different speeds. Here are the results, right? So let me tell you what I'm showing first, how to read this graph. On the bottom is a red trace, which is similar to the up-down position of my foot. Meaning when the trace is low, it means my foot has touched down. So that's when the energy cycle starts, right? But unlike jumping, there is an alternation, right? So I'm showing you this from 1 foot. So if you see 6 peaks, then I took 12 steps. So here's walking, here's jogging, and here's running. I just cranked up the speed on the treadmill. So I don't know what this reminds you of, but muscles tone up, which means increase in length. Tone up means increase in length, which most of us don't make the association. We think that toning up a muscle means the length decreases, right? So they are exerting more forces because we increase their length. So it's a little bit like a guitar string. So if you increase the tension, you produce a higher note. The equation is not exactly the same, but in this case, when I'm cranking, when I need to produce a higher speed, like a higher tone, I am cranking up the mean. So if you see the oscillation is at a different height for running and walking, right? So when I'm walking, when I'm running, the muscle length in general is at a higher place, and then the oscillation amplitude is also higher, right? So I matched. As you can see, the time scale is roughly the same on each one. So you can see the curves get narrower and narrower. This is the idea that precision is really, really important, right? So, yeah. How we time elastic energy retrieval plays a huge role, and I think is often ignored um, in preference to strengthening specific muscles, right? So I hope this gives you some interesting intuitions. Okay, so it's to get a better intuition for this idea at your own time, just take a resistance band and try to oscillate it like this. I don't know if you can see me. Maybe I'll stop sharing the screen. So you do that, and then see at some frequency will be more comfortable. Try to do it slower, try to do it faster. Don't let it go slack. And you will get an intuition for these ideas yourself. So what does it mean to get better at jumping? I'm going to show you a video from YouTube, a very popular jumping instruction video, and we're going to try to understand it from the perspective of what we've been talking about. So please give me an immediate thumbs down if you don't hear sound.
Now, a mistake that most people make when starting out that we get a lot of feedback about is they do 2 jumps, as you see here, for every time the rope swings around. I want you guys to get rid of this mentality and start. It's the easier way to jump rope, but it's not the correct way. And if you start off doing that, it's going to be a lot harder to get yourself into just doing 1 skip for every rope turn. Okay, so what I want you guys to do is start off by just hopping 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and get that consistent rhythm down and get used to counting, and then envision the rope spinning 1 time underneath you every time you do that.
Okay, so thumbs up if you can hear me now. Thank you. So let's look at the double jump more closely, right? So UA is going to be our demonstrator here. So unfortunately, I didn't record myself before I learned to undo the double jump. So UA helped me out by demonstrating this idea. So you're just going to monitor the position of her foot, of her big toe, as she's jumping. So in many cases, we are not even aware that this is happening. I'm going to show you the same thing in slow motion. Okay. So now let's look at the video I've been showing you the whole day and look at one jump per ton. I don't know if you can tell what I'm doing differently from her. To me, it is not obvious at all, as you'll see in a moment. So the instruction video that you saw, it explains the problem, says double jump, and presents a solution to overcome the problem, which is visualization, right? So sure, I understand this, but what we could cover with all the wonderful tools we have is try to get better insights as to why the double jump requires correction, right? So this is much harder to figure out. Okay, pull time. Why does the double jump require correction? What if I chose to do it then? Good. Endurance just means how many jumps, how many turns of the rope we can do, right? It's a waste, it's, right? Prevents high RPM. Okay, we're going to look at that. But why do I want, well, maybe I just want to jump slow, right? I don't want to actually jump fast. Waste of energy for sure, right? So you clearly have to do that extra jump. But the thing is, you're not doing it. So this was the interesting part. I told you, Wei, can you eliminate the double jump? I showed her this video in slow motion. I asked, can you eliminate the double jump? And the interesting thing that happened was that second jump didn't stay. The amplitude changed a little bit, but the whole sequencing of events did not change at all. Right? Unfortunately, I don't have that video. I'm sorry if I tempted you with that. Okay, these are all excellent suggestions. Let's look at what our arms are doing, right? So right now we're going to look at a muscle system, which is highlighted in blue in the skeleton to the left. And I have placed markers all along the muscle system. You see it all twists and turns, so it's hard to tell from your naked eye. So I'm going to monitor the muscle lengths in UA and myself, and we're going to look at compare the traces. So here in red is the length of the muscle system, which you'll see towards the right. And the up and down position is given by the blue trace, right? So in the blue trace, you see the double jump clearly. And then in the red trace, you see that the length of the muscle system is changing very reliably through every single jump. Now, let's look at mine. It's also oscillating with every single jump. What is the difference? So as somebody pointed out, I'm going to compare the single jump per rope turn and the double jump per rope turn. So I have put them approximately at the same time scale. What you can see is that the number of jumps that I'm doing and UA is doing is almost exactly the same. But the number of rope turns that I'm achieving is twice. So somebody said high RPM, you're on point, right? So true, but where did we do things differently? So one important point is to look at touchdown. I said when we touch down, we store elastic energy in our muscles, right? Here's the point of touchdown, and look at the difference in how much the length of our arms are. So the change is like 2%. It's almost imperceptible. It happens because the bones rotate a little bit with respect to each other, right? So at that point, so remember there's a slight delay between when the legs start receiving energy and when the hands, so that's this little delay. And then from there, I'm storing energy in my arms, whereas UA is using her arms and using muscular effort. This so most of these ideas were inspired through my dance teacher, and he gave me at least a really hard time for many years. I never understood, right? So but this graph is the difference between you're landing right or you're not landing right. So what is happening in the second case has to do with the mechanism we use to stabilize joints, and we'll talk about it in a later session. The idea is to give you an intuition. Think about jumping up and down, and then imagine that you close in. Of course, what I'm doing is extremely drastic. Nothing like this happens, but it's very subtle. And in some subconscious level, it's a fear response, right? So when we are about to hit something, we tense up so we can protect our joints from going beyond their limits. So it's a safety mechanism, but we often engage our safety mechanism without realizing it over and over again. So does it mean that it is not possible to be efficient with a double jump? The answer is absolutely not. So if I wanted to do a double jump, I could do it, but I could still receive elastic energy and give it back twice. So if you look here, for every up and down motion, there is 2 energy cycles in the single jump. For every up and down motion, there are 2 different energy cycles in the bottom trace, meaning the elastic energy stored in the arms, it's not increasing during touchdown, but it's decreasing. But the second jump, soon after the second jump, it starts increasing. So the idea is the second jump is used to prepare yourself for the jump. So this happens normally when we jump. So all that's happened here is that we have split our jobs into turning rope and jumping up and down. We are not doing one thing. This is one of the meanings of do one thing instead of doing 2 different things. So we covered that. So here's a common misconception about working harder. Muscles, if incorrectly engaged during elastic energy storage, can impede this process. So clearly, during touchdown in the double jump case, we are not storing more energy in the arms. We could still be storing them in the legs and so on, right? And we often compensate this with even more muscular force, because what ends up happening is once you touch down, there is extra energy that you just have to dissipate, and then you have to get it again to jump back. So the alternate perspective would be to let it happen. So when people say let it happen, the it mostly refers to elastic energy storage and the process of not interfering with the process of storing elastic energy in muscles. And then we can work hard to improve the precision with which we time our elastic energy retrieval. All of these things to actually execute are non-trivial. As I mentioned before, my dance teacher taught this to us, and it took years before I could even comprehend what he was saying. So I have a question for you. This is poll time again. How does this session change or enhance how we think about movement? Give me 1 second so I can activate the poll. You can just say, I knew all of this, or I don't agree with you, anything you want. Excellent. It looks like a lot of you enjoyed these ideas. So let me read through a couple of these and give you some brief comments. Intuitions are not necessarily true that. Most of the things that you typed are things that took me years to comprehend, but because I was forced to dance in the context of dancing, right? So if it doesn't have to be dancing, it can be anything, martial arts, anything. But these concepts can generalize because we're simply talking about muscle lengths. So one thing I will say is that I did highlight muscle lengths in today. It is a key measure. It is not the only measure. It is often ignored, and it is a key measure, and it connects with how with all the EMG studies, right? Yes, actually doing the tensegrity, whoever said this, thank you. Doing the experiment with this thing for myself was eye-opening, and comparing that to no matter years of intuition development were nothing compared to just looking at that video. Movement is related to many things. Yes. Yes, thank you. Thank you for all of your comments. Whoever wrote this thesis in 2004, we can talk later. Yes, this is why you shouldn't lock your knees. Okay, let's watch a video in that spirit. So here are some examples of how people typically think about movement, and some things that can be added on to them. I'm not saying any of these are wrong, but they certainly can be improved upon. And what I'm showing you through this, trying to show you through this course, is that an important aspect of what can be improved upon is ignored, which is length of muscles. So please give me an immediate thumbs down if you don't hear the sound.
Earlier this month, Eliud Kipchoge became the first person to run a marathon in under 2 hours. Absolutely incredible. I can't even imagine running a mile at the pace that he runs a full marathon. Now, in this video, I want to look at 5 things that we can all learn from looking at his running form to help us all become better runners. So the first thing I want to focus on is Kipchoge's foot strike. We're going to take a look and see how his foot comes and strikes the ground. We can see that as his foot meets the ground, he's landing with the balls of his feet, but doing so with a light mid-foot strike, rather than landing right up in more of a kind of a forefoot striking position, running on his toes, as we'd expect to see from a sprinter perhaps. Landing with a midfoot strike here allows him to keep contact time nice and short, keep the limb stiffness, which is something we'll talk about a little bit later, nice and firm, so that he actually manages to maximize the elastic return off the ground with each stride. We can see as we come.
Okay, so that was a bit long, but basically the idea this person is referring to is, if we compare these two athletes, is the moment, the angle at which the foot strikes the ground, right? So many of these shoes have a little curve in the bottom to accommodate for this type of individual who is running in the back. So Eliud Kipchoge set the world record very recently by running a sub 2-hour marathon. That is ridiculously ridiculously fast. My treadmill doesn't go as fast. So he ran for 2 hours at that pace. What I want to say is that the person behind him has a marathon that he ran at 2 hours, 5 minutes. So his speed is almost exactly the same as Eliud Kipchoge's. So what I want to bring to your attention is that we end up analyzing people who are at the very top, and we look for visual cues as to the positions of in their body, and we think that if we replicate it, we can also gain benefits similar to them. If we have the same habits, body arrangement, maybe that can be true to some extent, but either way is possible. You can do a heel strike or a toe strike and get extremely efficient, or you can do a heel strike or a midfoot strike and still be extremely inefficient. So it's the other way around. Work on the efficiency, then think about the pose, rather than setting the pose and not thinking about this efficiency and how much we recycle. So here is another popular instruction video, this time on jumping rope. If you can't hear it, again, give me a thumbs down.
As you can see here, as I'm just doing regular bounce, I'm up on my toes, my feet are not coming more than an inch or two off the ground, my knees are bent slightly, cushioning my impact so my joints don't get hurt, my elbows are in, and my hands are jutting out to the sides of my hips, and my wrists are controlling everything. Now,
Okay, so even in that video, the communication is entirely about where things are. Things can be in different places and you can still be efficient. That's all I'm trying to say. Position does not guarantee efficiency. That's all. So it's poll time again. I want you to watch this video one more time, the one I showed you in the very beginning. So it's poll time. Does looking at all the different videos I showed you in any way change what or how you perceive what you already saw before listening to these concepts? That's right. He was very relaxed. That's the thing. All of these extremely lightning fast moves, they're effortless. Even though, I mean, if you think about it, one of the fastest people I know, like Bruce Lee, I'll let you finish typing and then I'll... Just a few more seconds, then I would love to comment on this. I wish I could get into the lab. All right. So a lot of interesting questions. So let's, interesting comments. And let me, first of all, I'm extremely glad that some of your perceptions have changed and updated. This was very helpful to me when I was taught. So I'm glad I could do the same to other people. So this is an excellent observation, looking at how relaxed he looks throughout. So how muscles change length. I don't know if this is something we can consciously pick out without lots of visual training. right? So I always think about how my dance instructor saw these little things and kept pounding on it, right? Never, I still don't understand it as at next week. But it's having a very good mental model of how things fit together and move, and comparing that to the mental model is I think almost necessary to be able to see the movements. Otherwise, I think we just call them fluid, flowy. Our brain gives us summary terms, right? And then we just appreciate those. Yes, there is nothing wasted. He's very efficient, and that is also another thing that our brain picks up, right? So it just looks like the energy is coming out of nowhere. Very good dancers can just create explosive movements, almost seemingly out of nowhere. So heels never seem to touch the ground. Good observation. The position doesn't matter that much. But in this case, having the heels not touch the floor is a good thing if you're just bouncing boxing. Now, one of the things you said is everything is under control and calculated. So one of the most efficient movers probably in history was Bruce Lee. Unfortunately, he died at a very young age. But you can, if you have seen any of his movies, you can see that he doesn't have very large muscles, but the amount of force and damage he can create through his own art form is interesting. Even at a very young age, he was trying to create a form of movement, his own style of teaching based on his intuitions, and most of it was focused on eliminating everything that's unnecessary. Yeah, he moves in the space. So what is he thinking? This is an interesting question, and the answer might surprise you. A very famous ballet dancer said that I have to let go of my sense of self when I'm dancing, or that when that happens, he is at his best, right? And this thinking cannot happen at the time scale that we are talking about in hundreds of milliseconds. It's too slow to think and act and think and act. And we work in slower time scales. This is where the yoga and breathing and all of these different things fit in. And we'll talk about a little bit about how these concepts relate to how we apply, relate to those different disciplines in a future session. Okay, so to review, how do rigid and elastic elements work together to create efficient movement? It is the idea of tensegrity. It's the toy I showed you that I think lots of kids play with it, actually. You can get it in the plastic form. So what's the relationship between speed and energy cycle? This mental model I want you to take away is the idea of tuning the guitar. And finally, what does it mean to get better at jumping rope? Is the idea of energy efficiency. So it's like a car. When you brake, some of these cars take that energy and recycle, put it in the battery. It's a little bit like that. When you have an impact on the floor, you're storing. But the efficiency with which our bodies work is much, much, much higher than the efficiency with which a car energy from braking is recycled, right? I think somebody estimated if there was only muscular effort and in walking versus how much energy would be expended and how much is expended compared to that, it's only about 16% of what we would expect from pure muscle contractions. So it's like 10 to 20%. Different estimates vary depending on which paper you're reading. So it's possible to understand, take advantage of, and utilize these things in our own lives. So how do we work with these ideas? We'll talk a little bit about it next time. And I want to thank a lot of people who have helped me put this together, who helped me in my research. The dance teacher who taught me all the concepts I'm telling you, his name is Armin. He teaches the MIT dance team. And I will now, and thank you so much for coming. I will take questions in the Q&A session. At this stage, feel free to unmute yourself and just talk to me if you feel like doing so. Most welcome. All right, so it doesn't look like we have questions. So thank you so much for coming, and I hope to see you again next week at 4 p.m. Next week is a 1-hour session at 4 p.m. and we'll have Pallavi, a fellow postdoc, go through a small yoga session, and it'll give you some intuitions on what I talk about after the session. Maybe there's a question. Yes, excellent. Thank you for this question. Let me actually address that. So this is actually a toy model. How the tensegrity idea relates to the body is not straightforward, right? So as you saw, it doesn't work exactly like a tensegrity structure, right? In the sense that the moment I put an external force on this, all the bands get squished or change length simultaneously. That doesn't happen in our bodies, and there are differences. But the main idea with is the mechanism for changing lengths in the body is built into the shapes of the joints, and those become really, really important if you want to work with and optimize these ideas in your own. So yeah, absolutely right. Don't say tensegrity equals human body. It's a very, very, very useful model. I'm going to stay for a couple more minutes in case some questions come up. Oh, yes, I do. I will send them in an email later, but I can also tell you. So one of the main challenges of understanding the connection, we'll talk about this next class a little bit, is what do the bands correspond to in our body, right? Are they individual muscles, or is there some other organizing principle? I don't think there is a scientific conclusion, but there is a very, very compelling model. And the book you want, I recommend the first chapter of this book very highly. It is called Anatomy Trains, Trains, by Thomas Myers. Many people use this in the context of, use the idea of tensegrity in the context of physical therapy and all of these different practices, but I don't see it applied a lot in studying movement, studying movement the way I'm doing it. If you know of any, let me know. I'd be happy to learn more too. And all the pictures of the muscle systems, they were from that book I talked about, Anatomy Trains. Okay, with that, I will officially end the session, and I will still stay back until, in case some questions come up. But thank you again. I hope to see you next week.